Welcome to the Berean Remnant. I'm your host, Dr. Bernard Mauser. Today, what I want to talk to you about is an ethical theory called natural law theory. And so it has a long history. It's not just in the Christian tradition, but it was developed in the Middle Ages. And um, even today, there's still ongoing development of natural law theory. Part of the reason is that in Romans 2, you find the Apostle Paul talking about that there's a law that is written on the hearts of the Gentiles. And in Romans 1, he basically talks about how everyone knows that God exists, but some people, due to their wickedness, refuse to acknowledge that God exists. In Romans 2, he talks about even people like the Gentiles who don't have the law of Moses do by their nature the things that are written in the law, because there's a law written on their hearts. Now, it is possible that people can sear their conscience and thus ignore this moral law, but for the most part, you find throughout the world that people actually acknowledge this universal moral law. What is that universal moral law? That's the natural law. One of the premier defenders of this natural law theory in the 20th century was C.S. Lewis. You find it in his writing, Mere Christianity. He's talking about why is it that wherever you go, you talk about, or you hear people saying, some things are fair, some things are not fair. Even on the playgrounds, you hear this from young children. That's not fair, that's not right, you didn't follow the rules. It turns out there are certain rules that allow for humans to flourish. When we follow those moral rules that are in accordance with our flourishing, we're just following those natural laws. So, to take a step back, if you were to think about how to frame this ethical theory that we call natural law theory, how can we do so? And I think it's important just to start out with what we mean by something being good or evil. And once you understand that, ends up being the key to understand the rest of the natural law framework. So let's talk about uncontroversial examples. What is it that makes something a good eye or not? A good eye is one that sees. If it sees well, we say it's good. If it sees poorly, it's a bad eye. What is it that makes something a good ear? If you can hear well, you have a good ear. If you hear poorly, we say, oh, you've got bad ears. Now, of course, we might make the argument that a lot of our children have bad ears until they're maybe sufficiently disciplined to start paying attention to your mother, start paying attention to your father. When they tell you to do something, actually listen. Don't just hear them, listen to what they're saying. And we may do this in different ways in our own life when we ignore the instruction of somebody. If we're sufficiently motivated to not only hear them, but to listen to them, we can recognize that that's good. What are some of the systems in the human body that we can recognize them either functioning poorly or functioning well? Well, if the digestive system is functioning well in your body, we know that it's assimilating the nutrients you need and it's getting rid of the wastes that you don't need. And insofar as your digestive system is functioning properly, we say, oh, it's a good digestive tract. So we can recognize all these in particular ways. For those of us that are getting older, we can recognize, especially those of us that like to train and exercise a lot. If your body is working well, we say, it's good. My knees are good today. They're not aching. Or if you get a knee injury, you have to rehabilitate it to get it properly functioning. So all this brings us to what we mean by goodness and badness as it relates to mankind. If man is functioning in the way he ought, we say he's a good man. When he's not functioning in the way he ought, he's a bad man. Just like there's individual parts, individual ways that we can assess the human person, there's a broader way to apply it to man as a whole. So for objects, maybe a good pen is a pen that writes well. A good knife is one that cuts well. A bad knife would not cut well. So I call this the ABCs of natural law theory. A stands for action. And all of these are pointing to that last letter, E. Why do you act in one way versus another? Well, you act in one way versus another because you think that you're going to pursue one course of action for a particular end. That's the E. You have a certain end in mind. So I pursue this action. What is your action? Maybe I'm going to eat this pizza or I'm going to eat this hamburger for the end of what? Satisfying my appetite, quelling my rumbling stomach. Why do you do what you do? Okay, that's the B, the because. Why did you hit your brother? Why are you fighting with your brother? Oh, because of this. Oh, so there's an intentionality there. So you're acting one way versus another because that's your B. And again, with the pointing to the end, there's a teleology, we would say. There is a telos, there's an end, a goal of which you want your action to reach. Again, everything pointing to that end. We can assess, okay, is this a good reason to act one way versus another? Is there a way that you could have accomplished the same end by taking a different action, one that was maybe a good one? Rather than hitting your brother, maybe you could have reasoned with them. Don't you think that would have been better than, than, than hitting them? I had a conversation with a girl once, and she was considering getting a book on witchcraft. And I said, why do you want a book on witchcraft? And she said, well, I want to make sure my boyfriend gets back together with me. And I said, well, so your book on witchcraft helps your boyfriend get back together with you? Is that because, um, he's also into witchcraft and you're going to align your interests with his, or what's the idea here? No, I want to cast a spell that would induce him to get back together with me. And I said, okay, so basically the means by which you're going to get your boyfriend back together with you is casting a spell. And so it doesn't matter what means you use, as long as it gets back together with you, that's what makes it good, right? She says yes. So I said, so basically the good end of him getting back together with you justifies the means. She said, right. And I said, okay. So I had a job interview last week. I'm glad you're telling me this. I had a job interview last week, and I was in competition with another guy, and I knew he was after me, and I ran into him in the parking lot going in for the job interview after I had my interview. And I basically destroyed him in the parking lot, so he never even made it to the interview. So I, by default, got the job. Would that make it morally right? And she looked at me, a little scared. She said, no. And I said, right, I actually didn't do that. I'm trying to calm her down, but according to her moral theory, that would have been right. If the ends justify the means, then it doesn't matter what means you use. And I think we all recognize what's wrong with that. Morality is sufficiently more complex. So natural law theory actually does take into consideration the particular actions you take in order to reach good ends. The actions actually matter too. You can morally assess one action versus another to reach the end. You want not only the end to be good, but the action to be good as well. And the motivations. Why did you do one thing versus another? Those are actually part of the moral assessment. So natural law actually allows for the complexity of reality to assess whether one particular action is good or bad. The C talks about the circumstances. What are the circumstances under which you're operating? Those can help you decide whether an action is good or bad. So whether the person is your family member, whether they're your child, whether they're your spouse, tells you whether a particular action is morally good or not. And that'll help determine, okay, it's appropriate to act this way if the person is my child versus if the person is not my child. If the person's my child, if I basically put them in the car and take them to McDonald's for lunch, that is a morally good action. But if I just show up at a playground and I take a child who's not my kid to the local McDonald's and I load them in my car, we would call that kidnapping if I didn't have the parents' permission. Like, cops find you at McDonald's. Oh, I do this with my own kids. Why isn't it okay to do that with other people's kids? The circumstances determine that is actually an immoral thing. Their parents are freaking out at the local playground. They reported seeing you take their kid, and you took them to McDonald's. Oh yeah, I just wanted to feed them. Okay, you're not acting in a right way there. That would be something that's morally bad. So A, we act with an end in mind. You want the actions to be good. B, because you have certain intentions and motivations, and those can be either good or bad. So the same person carrying out two different actions, you could actually assess, okay, what are their motivations for one action versus another? Maybe the person takes care of grandma and you think, okay, that's really great to take care of grandma, but the reason they do so is immoral. They want grandma's inheritance. They don't love her at all. They just want to use her. Okay, well, now all of a sudden, what seemed like a good action ends up being corrupted and polluted by the evil intentions. Circumstances also help you decide, okay, is this something that is morally good or morally bad? D talks about how does this develop you? So, is a certain action going to develop you and move you toward your proper end or away from that? And then the E has to do with the end in itself. What is the proper end of man? We know what the proper end of a knife is. The proper end of a knife, that for which it's created, is to cut well. What is the proper end of man? Well, different philosophers have explained this in different ways, but Aristotle has a great defense of the end that all men recognize, the superordinate end toward which all men make their decisions is happiness. Now, how is it that we can properly reach this end? That's going to be something that philosophers disagree about. In the Christian tradition, what people have always said, and it makes sense if Christianity is true, and of course one of the things we submit is Christianity is true, that there's a God who has created all things. He has created each one of us, and he's created us in his image. He's given you, as creatures in his image, an intellect and a will. You can actually assess what is good with your intellect, and you could choose that with your will. And we could recognize that there's certain natural desires that God has implanted in us, and there's certain things that by your nature you desire, and there's a fulfillment of those natural goods. So I desire certain foods because I'm hungry. I have certain desires to drink because I thirst. And I can recognize that I could satisfy these natural desires. There exists real objects in reality, like food and water, that can satiate my hunger and my thirst. But there's a greater longing that we can recognize. So Aristotle says all men, by their very nature, desire to know. So there exists in reality things that help satisfy and satiate your desire to know. What do we call these things? Truths. So all these finite truths satiate in you certain longings of your natural desire to know. But with your complex nature as a human, you have more desires than just these lower, lesser desires of your lower appetites. So you do desire pleasures. You do desire food. You desire water. But there's this nature that you have by being created in God's image. When we say you need to act according to your nature, what we mean by that goes beyond these lesser desires. Your rational nature, when you're acting in accordance with reason, we say that you're acting in accordance with your proper nature. When you act contrary to reason, we say you're acting against your nature. So if you are acting irrationally, a lot of times you do things that are destructive toward your proper end. So it's in the nature of an acorn to develop into a fully mature oak tree. We wouldn't say, though, that when an acorn develops into a fully mature tree, we're not saying that it's choosing to do that. It's determined by its nature. But you, as a rational creature, a rational being, You have to choose how you're going to develop. When you choose to develop in the way proper to your nature, we say you're acting in a morally good way. So the thing that when a lion goes in and it mauls a jogger, we're not saying that it's immoral. It's just acting according to its nature. The thing that makes you a moral being is your rationality. You can choose against that, acting irrationally and thus immorally, or you can choose in accordance with your nature, and thus you're acting in a morally good way. What is it that we are all designed to do? Well, it's not just these lesser things, but it's also you desire to know and to be known. You desire to love and to be loved. So where you'll find this is a lot of us actually long for community and fellowship. And we actually find more fulfillment and more happiness as we go through our lives, developing good friendships. Having these lesser desires filled, you become closer and closer to the mark of being happy, but none of these things fully fill that desire you have. Why is it? Each of these things in creation only fulfill your finite longings, but there is a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts. And this is one of the things that Augustine recognizes. So St. Augustine in his Confessions talks about that what our ultimate longing is for God, and that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in Him. St. Thomas Aquinas, he uses the beatific vision to describe what is it we ultimately long for. He goes through and he dismisses each of the finite goods as being inadequate to fully fulfill our needs. We have increasing measures of happiness as these finite needs are met. But our ultimate longing isn't fulfilled until we encounter what he calls the beatific vision, until we're united with God in fellowship. So we find this ultimate friend in God. We have a longing for truth. We have a longing for goodness. And when we find good things in this world and we bring them into our domain and they satiate some of our lesser desires, each of these finite goods never fully fulfill you. We desire things that are beautiful. Anytime we encounter either acts of beauty or things that are pleasing in some way, we appreciate this beauty, but we're still left longing for more. So it's like it's the reason that G.K. Chesterton talks about in Orthodoxy, that there's a reason that we could still feel homesick even when we're at home, because we recognize that we long for more. We desire what is true and good and beautiful in an infinite way. And we only find that when we finally have a full community with God in eternity. So when we're finally in fellowship with Him, we will see the one who is infinite truth, goodness, and beauty. And He will fully fill all your desires. That is the proper end of man. Insofar as you're doing acts that are in accordance with your proper end, moving you toward that beatific vision, moving in ways that fulfill your proper nature, these are good actions. Any act that you do that's against that, against fulfilling that end, we would say those are immoral acts and evil acts. All of this is in accordance with what you find even throughout Scripture. So at the end of Revelation, you see where your ultimate end is. Do the Gentiles have this? Of course they do. Jesus mentions this in the Sermon on the Mount, that the pagans run after the very things that also believers run after. So look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or store away in barns, but your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? And so you hunger and thirst, you desire clothes, and you chase after these things. Look at the lilies of the field. Not even Solomon, in all his splendor, was clothed like one of these. So if this is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown in the fire, how much more will He clothe you, O you of little faith? So don't say, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things. See, the pagans recognize these natural desires. So, what are you supposed to do? Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. All of these point to the fact that the pagans recognize the natural law. God is going to provide for you all these things, but even more. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Our ultimate fulfillment is only found in the Lord. It's something that you could have, you could find different levels of happiness during this life, but your ultimate happiness, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God, the throne of God. You will fully rest when you rest in the Lord, and you will find that fulfillment not in this life, but in the life to come. So hopefully this helps orient you as to what like Christian natural law theory looks like, and why any theory of natural law that leaves aside the question of God and his role in it actually leaves aside the most important element of natural law theory. So Bereans, I hope this has encouraged you in some way and that you have a great day.